second front or wind it down? The new year begins with yet another trip by the U.S. Secretary of State to Israel. What message does Antony Blinken carry for Benjamin Netanyahu? As the war in Gaza enters its fourth month, we'll ask about Washington's calls for restraint and the potential for escalation with Lebanon. This in the wake of last week's airstrike that killed a senior Hamas official in a Hezbollah stronghold of Beirut. Blinken's visit comes as Israel's military announces a drawdown from northern Gaza, the beginning of the end of a brutal campaign or a redeployment to the northern border. The Prime Minister continues to insist on a long war. We'll ask about simmering tensions between Netanyahu and his military command and the staying power of the longest-serving leader in Israel's history, Netanyahu's coalition with a far right that wants to annex Gaza. That coalition seems safe for now, despite the growing domestic pressure and the knowledge that its main backer, the United States, clearly does not want another forever war happening in an election year. Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking about Blinken's message for Netanyahu. Joining us from Tel Aviv, Charles Freilich, former Israeli Deputy National Security Advisor, today Senior Fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
From London, Nomi Bar Yaakov, Associate Fellow at the think tank Chatham House. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Francois.
Also in the UK capital, Gilbert Achcar, Professor of Development Studies and International Relations at SOAS University. Good to see you again.
Thank you, and good evening.
Stephen Ekovich, Professor Emeritus at American University of Paris, is with us as well. How are you?
Always good to be with you, Francois.
All right, your reactions on the hashtag F24debate. Yeah, attention squarely on Israel's northern border. The Prime Minister visiting with troops there this Monday amid news that an airstrike had now targeted the car of a senior Hezbollah commander in southern Lebanon. Catherine Viette has more.
Israeli airstrikes hit southern Lebanon near the town of Kiam. Following the October 7th attacks, the border has become the scene of regular clashes between Hezbollah and the IDF. On Monday, the militant group targeted the surroundings of Kiryat Shmona in northern Israel, the same place Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu visited.
I chose to come to Kiryat Shmona on the day we're the target of bombing and anti-tank fire. I really appreciate the service you and your friends are doing here to protect our northern borders, which sends a message to Hezbollah. Hezbollah made a big mistake in 2006 and is still making mistakes today.
In recent days, the conflict has escalated following the assassination of Hamas's deputy chief Salah al-Aruri in Beirut. The risk of a wider regional conflict has never been closer. However, according to the Washington Post, citing American intelligence, Israel would have difficulty winning a war against Hezbollah because its military assets and resources are spread too thin with the ongoing conflict in Gaza. The IDF now says it's focusing on the Radwan forces, an elite unit of Hezbollah. According to Reuters, Israel's drone strike on Monday killed the unit's senior commander.
What Israel wants from Hezbollah is for the Radwan forces to withdraw from the border. And if this doesn't happen, Israel is threatening a limited military operation. We don't really know what that means and if it will serve a purpose. This is the context for the recent escalation.
Hezbollah, which has well-trained fighters and tens of thousands of missiles and rockets, would also like to avoid a major escalation, according to U.S. officials who spoke to the Washington Post.
Charles Freilich, the killing of the senior Hezbollah commander in southern Lebanon, our correspondent in Beirut earlier, wondering aloud whether this was a Qassam Soleimani moment here. How big a story is this?
The Soleimani case as well was an isolated attack which impacted the IRGC's capabilities for a while, but it wasn't a turning point in history, nor is this. But I think the important point to understand here, and I'm not sure this came across in the report, the cross-border firing didn't start with this attack. It started pretty much the day that the war in Gaza started. Hezbollah, with Iran's obvious agreement and maybe encouragement, tried to create a low-level second front to tie down Israeli forces and, of course, to just impose an ongoing cost on Israel. And so this has been going for months now. And there's a question whether, 80,000 people from Israel's northern communities were evacuated at the beginning of the war. When do they get to go back home? There are rockets and anti-tank missiles being fired across the border daily. This is a situation that no sovereign state could possibly tolerate. So Israel is taking limited moves so far to try and prevent it. This comes after decades of conflict with Hezbollah. It has to end.
After that strike last week, which the airstrike by Israel in the heartland of Hezbollah stronghold in Beirut that targeted a senior Hamas figure, there was this fear that the escalation would go full throttle then. It didn't happen. Why?
Well, because I think Hezbollah doesn't want, or probably doesn't want, an all-out escalation now. Israel is on the alert. It's fully mobilized. It's ready. That wasn't the case, unfortunately, on the Gaza front on October 7th. So a certain level of hostilities serves their purposes. Hostilities at too high a level may not. And if and when they decide to really have a significant escalation, I think it'll be for their own purposes rather than in support of Hamas, which they support up to a point, but they don't want to risk an all-out war for Hamas.
Nomi Bar Yaakov, what response are you expecting after the killing of this senior Hezbollah commander?
Well, I think it's certainly a call for an escalation on the part of Israel. And I think I agree with Charles that Hezbollah have been very measured in their response thus far. My main fear, I think no one can predict exactly what Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, is going to do. He'll obviously have to retaliate. The retaliation will presumably be of a more serious nature than the warning after Salah al-Aruri's assassination last week. But the problem with these provocations are that there is a constant risk of escalation beyond a certain point, and we may reach a certain point whereby Hezbollah will feel the need to retaliate in a manner that then will trigger a wider war in the region, and that's my greatest fear.
And
I don't think this is the law. I think we need to watch the series of exchanges which are clearly escalating, and hope that with Antony Blinken's visit, that his forceful words, he's been to a number of countries in the region, and hopefully the message will be loud and clear to Israel. Make sure that you're not dragging yourselves into an all-out war in Lebanon.
By the way, we have breaking news with the Israeli military announcing that it's killed Hassan Hakashah. It's a central Hamas figure in Syria who was behind, it says, rocket fire at Israel. Gilbert Ashkar, what do you make of the sequence of events of the last week now with the killing of two and possibly a third senior figure, two from Hamas and one today from Hezbollah?
Well, I think that points to the obvious fact that Israel waited until the intensive bombing campaign that has been going on in Gaza, which has reached those genocidal proportions that we have seen, that this bombing campaign comes to an end and they can move there, as they have announced, to a lower intensity phase of the war in Gaza. So they waited until then to turn towards the northern front, towards Lebanon, which they have been doing now. Now, of course, I don't expect Israel to think of a new invasion of Lebanon, but what they are threatening with, and which is what the Minister of Defense, Israeli Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, threatened with from the beginning and earlier last summer already, to destroy Lebanon, to apply the so-called Dahya doctrine once more in Lebanon, which is a massive destruction like we have seen in Gaza. So this threat remains on the table. It is now reactivated since the major phase in Gaza is over, of bombing, I mean. And of course, now it all depends on the United States, because Israel cannot engage in a new exchange of very intensive bombing with Lebanon, with Hezbollah, without US participation. The United States has been instrumental, has been absolutely crucial for the war that Israel waged on Gaza. It is basically the first joint US-Israeli war ever, because it has been done with an airlift, permanent airlift of US material to Israel. Whatever claims the Biden administration has, it has been integral part of this war on Gaza.
Yeah, it's been airlifting ammunition on a daily basis, Gilbert Ashkar. But does the United States want to back a campaign against Lebanon?
Well, I would presume not, but it's difficult to see how much this administration is willing to coerce Israel, to tell Israel, look, we are not going to help you on this. We are not going to provide you with what you need to carry on another intensive bombing campaign. I haven't seen signs of such attitude from the administration. We have seen only hypocritical moral admonishment to Israel and a lot of concern about the day after in Gaza, which is quite far actually, and nothing as concrete measures. So we have to see what this Biden administration would do, especially that they know that the Republican right and Donald Trump, and we have presidential election, as you know, next fall in the United States, will be there outbidding them at first opportunity.
You heard earlier Stephen Ekovich, Nomi Bar Yaakov, mention the timing of all this with the arrival of Antony Blinken. Your thoughts on what he's going to say when it comes to Lebanon?
We can speculate if you want. I think we can probably conclude, say that there will be a reiteration of a very long-standing American policy that is the support of Israel. But that's the baseline. Given that, there will probably be some message about some forms of restraint, or at least publicly, it has to seem that the Americans are giving.
But you heard Gilbert Ashkar say that there can't be a campaign in Lebanon without U.S. support. So
of course not.
Will that mean no campaign in Lebanon? Because you heard Benjamin Netanyahu hinting that this could be like 2006 again.
Okay, so this is gesticulation, and it's dangerous gesticulation backed up by arms. But as we've already seen, no side wants this to escalate any further. So the temperature is up. It's dangerous. But once again, neither side seems to want to take the fatal step toward anything that's very extremely escalatory. Now, we have to constantly bring into focus here that the United States is going through a presidential campaign. Biden is on a tightrope. 3/4 of American Jews support what Biden is doing in Israel, in Gaza, the Gaza operation. This is very important in a state like Florida, where Jews are also older, and which tend to support very solidly American policy vis-a-vis Israel. The Democrats don't have to worry about the Jewish vote in California or the Jewish vote in Manhattan or New York. But, Florida is a swing state with a lot of electoral votes. On the other hand, Biden can't go too far in that direction either, because polls show that the voting bloc in the United States between the 1824 voting bloc is 60% favorable in sometimes vague way to Palestine. So in declaratory policy and electoral politics, he's on a tightrope. He has to please both of those electorates if he's going to win re-election in the coming election. And it's too early to tell, by the way.
All right, let's listen in because the U.S. Secretary of State speaking upon his arrival.
United Arab Emirates to here in Saudi Arabia. Everywhere I went, I found leaders who are determined to prevent the conflict that we're facing now from spreading, doing everything possible to deter escalation, to prevent a widening of the conflict. We also talked about the future of this region. And I think there's broad agreement on a few basic objectives. First, that Israel and Israelis should be able to live in peace and security, free from the fear of terrorist attacks or aggression from any of their neighbors. Second, that the West Bank and Gaza should be united under Palestinian-led governance. Third, the future of the region needs to be one of integration, not division and not conflict. And fourth, for that to happen, we need to see the establishment of an independent Palestinian state. Now, no one I talk to thinks any of this will be easy. All recognize the hurdles, and no one thinks that anything will happen overnight. But we agreed to work together and to coordinate our efforts to help Gaza stabilize and recover, to chart a political path forward for the Palestinians, and to work toward long-term peace, security, and stability in the region as a whole. I also found across the board that the countries we visited, the leaders we spent time with, are prepared to make the necessary commitments, to make the hard decisions, to advance all of these objectives, to advance this vision for the region. We're heading now to Israel, where I'll have an opportunity to share with Israeli leaders everything I've heard thus far on this trip, and also to talk to them about the future direction of their military campaign in Gaza. I will press on the absolute imperative to do more to protect civilians and to do more to make sure that humanitarian assistance is getting into the hands of those who need it. We'll also, of course, focus on our relentless efforts to bring back the hostages, Americans, Israelis, and others. And we'll talk about how we see the future for the region and for Israel. And I'm convinced that there is a future path that can actually bring lasting peace and security for Israel, that can ensure that October 7th never happens again, and that can bring the region together, that can meet the aspirations of the Palestinian people, and do it in a way that makes this a region focused on the future, not on the challenges of the past. With that, happy to take a couple of questions.
Secretary, your trip is partly about trying to prevent a wider war, but Israel has now killed 2 Hezbollah leaders within a week. What does that say about U.S. leverage over Israel, and doesn't that risk a second front? And secondly, Qatari Prime Minister Al-Thani yesterday said military strikes against the Houthis were not the best option and that he preferred diplomacy since the military strikes would raise regional tensions. What message are you giving to Arab partners in the region about U.S. and coalition efforts and intentions towards potential military strikes in Yemen?
Well, first, Ian, with regard to Lebanon, it's clearly not in the interest of anyone, Israel, Lebanon, Hezbollah, for that matter, to see this escalate and to see an actual conflict. And the Israelis have been very clear with us that they want to find a diplomatic way forward that creates the kind of security that allows Israelis to return home. Nearly 100,000 Israelis have been forced to leave their homes in northern Israel because of the threat coming from Hezbollah in Lebanon, but also allows Lebanese to return to their homes in southern Lebanon. And we're working intensely on that effort and doing so diplomatically. Second, with regard to the Red Sea, the international community as a whole faces a challenge. These attacks, consistent attacks by the Houthis on international shipping, are a threat to everyone. We talked about this yesterday. You've got about 15% of the world's commerce every day going through that strait, going through the Red Sea. And these attacks are having a real effect on the prices that people have to pay for food, for medicine, for energy. ships have to get diverted to other places, insurance rates go up, and the basic principle of freedom of navigation is what's at stake. So the international community has a real stake in upholding that principle. As I said, we've had 40 countries come together to make clear that what the Houthis are doing has to stop. And we have other countries that have made clear that if it continues, there have to be consequences. So our strong view, our strong preference is that the Houthis get the message that they're receiving from countries around the world that this needs to stop, and that's what we're focused on.
Before the October 7th attacks, you and other aides to President Biden were trying to pursue the idea of Saudi-Israel normalization. And it seems that's become much more difficult in light of the attacks, given the animus on different
Yeah, we've been listening
now.
there to live remarks from the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken departing Saudi Arabia as he heads next for Israel. Charles Freilich, your reactions listening to the words of the U.S.'s top diplomat?
Well, I think the Secretary stated forcefully and clearly the American positions that have been pretty apparent since the beginning of the war. The U.S. certainly does not want to see a further escalation and an expansion of the war, and that's understandable, and that's a sentiment that most of us, I hope, share. But I'd like, with your permission, to comment on a couple of the things that were said earlier by some of the other participants. I was wondering how long it would take for somebody to throw out the buzzwords, the propaganda buzzwords, genocide, Israel's genocidal war. I was happy to hear that we were not accused this time of apartheid, racism, Nazism, and all sorts of other horrific things. If one wants to talk about a genocidal war, Hamas, their charter, officially states that their objective is, I quote, the obliteration of the state of Israel. Now, talk about genocide. And the first time they ever had a chance to implement this through a military success, they crossed the border and slaughtered 1,200 Israelis. In American terms, by the way, that's the equivalent of 40,000 people, about 14 9/11s. Israel is fighting here a defensive war, even if sometimes the defense has to be carried out offensively.
Right, but it's not how it's perceived by the rest of the world after more than 3 months. When you see the casualty toll in Gaza, when you see, for instance, the killing over the weekend of those 2 journalists who were covering the conflict.
No journalists are ever targeted intentionally, and the war, if it happens against Hezbollah, is a war of self-defense. And the fact that people may perceive it differently doesn't make them right. Public opinion changes over numerous things over the time. And I'm not saying, by the way, that Israel is above criticism. No country is. But in terms of a war, a genocidal war, it really takes a certain degree of gall to present it in those terms. And the Secretary, the U.S. can't force Israel's hand, whether it's in Lebanon or in Gaza. It certainly has a lot of influence. But the reason that the U.S. has not put heavy pressure on Israel to stop the war in Gaza, it's tried to affect how Israel goes about waging it, maybe. And Israel actually, in the end, came to the same conclusion anyway, and it's transitioning now. But the reason that the U.S. has supported the Israeli position overall till now is because it supports it, because it understands that it is a defensive war.
Right, so Gaza is one thing. What about that question that was put by that reporter to the U.S. Secretary of State? How much leverage does the United States have over Israel when it comes to Lebanon, and how far it escalates there?
Well, again, the U.S., of course, has leverage over Israel. We're close allies, and Israel is highly dependent on the U.S., but it's not complete control, nor does the U.S. seek complete control. And again, as in the Gaza case, fundamentally, the U.S. supports the Israeli position. Hezbollah is also formally committed to Israel's destruction, has been waging this war since it was established in 1983. And this didn't start with the attack today or last week. It didn't actually start with the attacks that have been ongoing since October 7th. It's been going on for 40 years now. And that's why, and again, for Israel's destruction. And that's why the U.S. supports Israel in this fundamentally.
Nomi Bar Yaakov, your thoughts on what Antony Blinken in private will say to Benjamin Netanyahu when it comes to the escalation we're witnessing, and I say escalation, I don't say it lightly, with Lebanon?
I think he'll be quite firm. I think he'll say the last thing the US wants is to be dragged into a war in Lebanon, and given the close ties between Hezbollah and Iran, the very last thing the US wants to do is to be dragged into a war between the US and Iran. And I think that Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, may drag the US into such a war if it escalates. I'll go back to what I said earlier. The risk is that this, there's gradual escalation, incremental escalation, and you reach a certain point of no return. We've just seen 3 assassinations outside the borders of Gaza. 2 in Lebanon, 1 in the heart of Hezbollah, 1 in South Lebanon, also the heart of Hezbollah, and 1 in Syria. So there's clearly a risk. And the question is, what is Antony Blinken, US Secretary of State, going to do about it beyond words? What leverage is he going to have over Netanyahu? Netanyahu is more interested in prolonging the war than he is in anything else. The last thing he needs is the various trials that he's been charged with corruption, 3 different trials. He's already been indicted. Everything is on hold. I mean, the trials are on hold because of the war. He also lost the judicial overhaul. The coup against the judiciary is on hold because the Supreme Court basically ruled that the basic law that the government, this extreme right-wing government has enacted is illegal and they cannot do so. So he's already lost a number of battles. So he has a personal interest in prolonging the war, extending the war. And as I said, it's very risky. The big question is, what is Antony Blinken going to do beyond words? What is he going to actually do in order to prevent escalation? I have no doubt in my mind whatsoever that there's a consensus in the Arab world, including Turkey, all the countries that he's visited, that the implementation of the Arab Peace Initiative, the Saudi Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, then was modified in Beirut in 2007, that is the blueprint for an end game. We need to have an end game here for the day after, and we then work sort of backwards and away from that. No country is going to rebuild Gaza. No country is going to invest a penny in Gaza, including Qatar, unless there is a framework. And we know what the end game. He made it very loud and clear. He said the Palestinians, to quote him, as we just heard, their aspirations need to be realized. It was not quite the words he used, but he did use the word Palestinian aspirations. That means a contiguous West Bank Gaza state. And at the moment in Israel, no one wants to hear about it.
Yeah, let me ask you, Nomi, because earlier you heard Gilbert Achcar connecting the dots between Israel's military announcing over the weekend that it's drawing down operations in northern Gaza, and now this escalation that we're witnessing at the northern border with Lebanon. So here's my question to you. Where is it going as Antony Blinken arrives? Is it going towards a different front, or are we going to see the U.S. calling time?
Well, I don't know what the U.S. is going to do, and it'll be very interesting to see both what Antony Blinken says after his meetings and also what Netanyahu says after the meetings, because I can guarantee they're not going to be speaking in the same language, in the same tone. So that's to sort of, to be what the Israeli military announced that 2024 is going to be a year of war. Yeah, they've released 150 reservists at the moment, but basically told them, okay, this is a bit of a break, stand by, you will be called back in. So by changing phases from phase 2 to phase 3 in Gaza, there's a long, long way away from the end of the war. Since Israel set its targets as releasing the hostages, there are currently 126 hostages. 24 are known to be dead, according to the Israeli army and the Israeli government. The question is, how do you prevent further deaths? So many of the hostages are badly wounded and elderly and held in dreadful conditions in the tunnels with not much food, if any, and not much oxygen. And those who've come out, the hostages that have come out, have reported dire conditions. So the question is, how does Israel get 126 hostages back, including the bodies, and meet its targets? It's a question to Israel, and meet the target of destroying Hamas, which I don't think is a realistic goal in any event. So I think there'll be a clash between what Antony Blinken is the message he's going to come with, having consulted extensively, deeply and broadly with a large number of countries in the region, and where the Netanyahu government is standing. I think there are 38 extreme ministers in this government that live in a completely different reality to the reality that the rest of the world live in. And the question really is how to prevent of the many things he said. The question, Blinken, the question is A, how to prevent escalation, B, how to end the war and release the hostages, and then C, how do you move from that to ensuring that the aspirations of the Palestinian people who deserve to have a state, long overdue, is met, including having a secure Israeli state. As I said earlier, at the moment, no one in Israel, or hardly, wants to hear about two states.
No sign of wavering inside of Israel's ruling coalition. Netanyahu and his allies control 64 of Parliament's 120 seats, but with calls for elections now heard at a rally at Tel Aviv on Saturday, that moment of national unity after October the 7th no longer applies to domestic politics. This Monday, senior opposition leader Yair Lapid calling on the likes of Benny Gantz to quit the government's National Unity War Cabinet, saying, quote, they're not saving the people of Israel, they're saving Netanyahu. Do you feel, Gilbert Ashkar, as though now the pressure is building on Israel's prime minister to wind it down?
Yes, but please allow me to reply to what has been said about my own intervention. I mean, I listened politely. I expected you to give me the floor after the comments on my remarks. So please, I need to reply to that. The former Israeli security official said that I mean, the equivalent of 40,000 Americans were killed on October 7th. It seems he doesn't realize that the equivalent of 3,300,000 Americans have been killed until now in Gaza by the Israeli armed forces. That is more than 1% of the population of Gaza has been killed. And that is not to mention 80% of the territory destroyed, not to mention 85% or 90% of the population displaced, and without getting the necessary food and other needs that they have. All this it does not count. And then the former security official says that Hezbollah has been against Israel since 1983. Well, good remark. What was happening in 1983? Well, Lebanon was occupied. Israel occupied Lebanon up to Beirut and ended up occupying Beirut itself, which is my city, by the way. And that's what led to the creation of Hezbollah. And Hamas, well, Hamas was created in 1987 in Gaza. That is after 20 years of occupation of Gaza.
Okay, so we hear, Gilbert, we hear the differences between you and Charles Freilich on this.
No, but I mean, I have to state these things because
I hear you, but I mean, let's
when someone accuses the other of doing propaganda and they embark on propaganda discourse, that's what you get. But anyhow, yes, getting back to your question.
The question is the pressure building on Netanyahu now?
Well, the pressure is building on Netanyahu, but that's not the pressure that you are pointing to, at least from what I can tell from reports about the mood in Israel. There is a very vast majority in favor of continuing the war. And I'm not sure that if this same very vast majority would be against continuing the war even against Lebanon. So this remains to be seen. I think it will more depend on what happens within the coalition, the existing coalition, and maybe within the Quds itself, because we know that there is some old rivalry between the Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. I mean, if there is something to happen at this level, that would be at this in this framework. But I don't see any one of those who hold real influence today in Israel being against continuation of the war.
Stephen Ekovich, is the pressure coming more from abroad or more domestically?
Oh, look, in no way can the United States seem to be putting pressure on a Israeli government to change a government. No way. The Israelis themselves will have to decide what kind of government they want. And if any effective pressure will come from inside, whether that's about regarding elites and the powerful around the prime minister or not, whether it comes from the population, that has to be and will be viewed by the United States. The United States will not mingle or meddle into a choice of a new government. They absolutely cannot do that, and they won't want to be seen to do that. Now, I'm not sure, I don't know to what extent Antony Blinken can be firm with the Israelis. Even if he is firm, I doubt that it's going to have that much influence. What we heard, we listened, all of us together, to Antony Blinken. That was a predictable speech. We predicted it even before we heard it. In fact, we could have predicted it. Yeah, okay. We could have heard that speech 10 years ago, 20 years ago, essentially.
Right, but that's diplomacy. It's what you say in public is not the same as what you say in private.
Yeah, okay, so we didn't learn anything in public. We sure would like to know, but we can only speculate about what might be happening in private. And what I'm saying here is, in private, I'm sure that there's not going to be pressure on Netanyahu to change his government. The United States cannot do that, even though the United States may believe that the Netanyahu government is not presenting a very good image of Israel. It doesn't help the international image of Israel to have a prime minister like this, especially with this policy in the West Bank. And there's this amalgamation, as the French say, an assimilation between the policy in the West Bank and what's going on in Gaza. It's unfortunate in some ways that indeed that Netanyahu is the current prime minister, because it's not good communication to the rest of the world. That's one thing. In terms of the accusation of genocide against Israel, it's just an unsavory irony that it's South Africa that's bringing this to the International Criminal Court. South Africa, which would not arrest Omar al-Bashir of Sudan when he visited South Africa in 2015.
Right. Well, we could talk about that a little bit later on. Charles Freilich, let me ask you, that demonstration on Saturday where we heard that call for fresh elections, the remarks by Yair Lapid, one of the big opposition leaders, calling on fellow opposition bigwigs to quit that unity war cabinet. Does that matter?
Well, sure, it matters. As someone who has participated in these demonstrations for the last few years, I have great sympathy for what they were saying. The opposition to the government is not over the war, the conduct of the war. There is a broad consensus in Israel that the war has to continue, and maybe even, not that anybody wants to see this, but maybe even expand to Hezbollah, because there is a feeling that we are fighting for our lives here against organizations who seek our destruction, quite simply. Now, I think what we will. I think Israel stands before a dramatic political earthquake. I think it will happen in the coming months. It was postponed by the war, and
so coming months, not coming days or weeks.
Oh no, of course not. We are still in the midst of the war, and it will take time. It won't come from within the ruling coalition, and I don't even think it'll come stage one from within the Knesset, the parliament. I think what we'll see as the fighting in Gaza continues to die down in the coming weeks, or at least the level will decrease, we will then see the public feeling comfortable to start turning out in the streets in big numbers. And if we saw something like 500,000 a week at the height of the protests over the judicial reform, I think we'll probably see 2 or 3 times that, because now it won't be a matter of the center and the center left. The right wing is fit to be tied over what happened, over the incredible failure of the government to prepare for this war. I think we're going to see a major change, and I think we'll probably see a much more centrist government in a matter of months. But also, this entire discussion has been focused on Israel, which is, I find, somewhat strange, whereas there is one terrorist organization called Hamas, and there's another one called Hezbollah, both of whom call for Israel's destruction. And then the discussion is about Israel. And again, Israel isn't above criticism. And it's not as if we haven't made mistakes. Of course we have. But there's also a side which has repeatedly put forward proposals for peace, including with a willingness to withdraw from almost 100% of the West Bank and 100% of Gaza, and a side which has rejected every possible proposal and says that it's against any peace proposal. And the focus of the discussion is just on Israel, a little one-sided.
Nomi Bar Yaakov, is it a little one-sided to look at Israel's next move?
I'm sorry, Francois, could you repeat the question? Israel's next move?
Yeah.
Is the question, what do I think Israel's next move is going to be?
Yeah, and is it one-sided to be talking about it when we're at this point, when there is this pressure on the prime minister, again, as we say, both internationally and domestically?
I think the domestic pressure is going to grow immensely as soon as the war ends. And that's partially why, or mainly why, he is prolonging the war. And that is why he's so dangerous. And that's what we need to watch out for. You're not going to get 500,000 or 1 million or 1.5 million protesters protesting for Netanyahu's removal until the war ends. And I'm just reiterating how dangerous he is, and how catastrophic the situation could be. It's already a catastrophe in Gaza, and I understand exactly why the focus of the discussion is where it's at, because there are 22,883 civilians, not civilians, sorry, I take that back, Gazans dead, excluding those under the rubble. Yes, it is horrendous what happened on the 7th of October. It is absolutely, beyond awful and beyond words. But the only solution to what's going on is to have a political settlement, both for the stability of Israel and Gaza and the West Bank, which will have to be a contiguous Palestinian state eventually, and hopefully not before too long, and also in Lebanon. Israel is saying that United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701 isn't implemented. That's the resolution that calls for Hezbollah to be north of the Litani River. It is true that it is not implemented. It is true that Hezbollah sit on the border and have been doing so after Israel withdrew. But there is no way that Israel can take on Hezbollah with their 150,000 precise rockets, and they have a far greater military capability and superiority to Hamas. And they also have a border with Syria that borders with Iraq and Turkey. So ammunition could flow anytime if Israel takes them on. It's not like Gaza, where you have Egypt on one side and Israel on the other side. So it's a completely different scenario. And it's also a different scenario because Iran backs Hezbollah. So the only way to deal with the situation is really to look at a comprehensive solution for the whole region that will allow every state in the region to live in peace and security.
Unfortunately, we're running short on time. Nomi Bar Yaakov, I want to thank you so much for joining us from London. I want to thank as well Gilbert Ashkar for being with us from the UK capital, Charles Frelich in Tel Aviv. I want to thank you as well. Stephen Ekovich, thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.